August 27, 1884. The Carroll Herald, Carroll, Iowa. Fabled Monsters. The zoological fancies of ancient and medieval writers and explorers. How the belief in the phoenix, the unicorn, and seahorse originated. Wonderful stories told of the serpents with legs and lions with snake tails. At what period fancy began its work in zoology is a question which is discreetly avoided or acknowledged a puzzle by those writers who have diligently delved through the records of all peoples for traces of fabulous denizens of the earth, the sea, and the air. That fascinating terror of the nursery, the fiery dragon, it is agreed, is probably the degenerate offspring of the awful ichthyosauri and plesiosauri of prehistoric ages. But though, in other directions, their learning was by no means small, the most ardent Egyptologist and Assyrian student has never claimed for the vanished people of those countries a knowledge of geology which would enable them to drag from the rocks the fragments and piece together in a comprehensive form the remains of these prodigious flying lizards. Yet, chiseled on the earliest stone monuments of Egypt and Assyria and India, exact representations are found of the dragon which St. George overcame in a mighty battle, and which the annals of Winchester say existed in England in such numbers in 1177 as to be a great danger and scourge. St. George's dragon was 50 feet long from the shoulders to the tail. Its scales glistened like silver and were hard as brass. But Livy's dragon was much larger and so terrible that it stopped the march of the Roman army in Africa. Diodorus saw one which was 60 feet long, brought to Alexandria by a slave to please Ptolemy II. St. Michael's dragon, the monkish chronicle says, was much larger than this. In certain parts of the Far East, which was ever rich with zoological fables, the dragon is unknown, but its place is supplied by fanciful creatures even more terrifying and endowed with greater powers of wreaking destruction upon mankind. The golden pages of the Arabian Nights have made us familiar with the great roc. There is a Persian drawing extant which depicts this fearful bird shaped like an eagle, flying through the air with an elephant in either claw and an ox in its beak. Marco Polo says he saw a roc whose outstretched wings measured 16 paces from tip to tip. Not to be outdone by the latter, that adventurous Englishman, Sir John Mandeville, in his account of his trip around most of the then known world, relates that he beheld one in the Chinese seas, which was besides Polo's like a hawk to a sparrow. El-Wardi the Persian writes that upon an island in an unnamed sea there was in his time a roc's egg 100 cubits high, a firm, white, glistening dome, big enough to serve as shelter for an army. An island in the Chinese Sea was marked out as the home of these great birds. Singularly enough, the roc appears to have been forgotten for 1,000 years, to in times quite recent again interpose its monstrous shape before the sun. A book of travels published within 25 years mentions that the fable yet lingers in parts of Persia and on some of the islands of the Chinese seas. The Greeks and Romans had a winged creature with the head of a woman, which alighted upon battlefields and feasted upon the flesh of the dead and dying. This was the harpy. The morbid and starved imagination from which this fable sprang was, it is not difficult to trace, the parent also of a flock of ghoulish creatures, such as the werewolf, human beings that devoured their kind, and the cynocephaly, a creature with the body of a human and the head and appetite of a dog. Marco Polo, who never failed to come in contact with all manner of wanderers in his travels, saw a cynocephaly in the island of Angamon. His vivid description of it, perhaps, gave points to the circus manager who a few years ago coined a small fortune exhibiting a variety of ape, little known, as the cynocephalus of the ancients. The Cockatris, or basilisk, was an interesting fancy. It would, perhaps, be more correct to say, since this beautiful bird, the fruit of an egg laid by a cock 7 years old, is still believed to be a reality among some of the ignorant peasantry of Europe. The Cockatris, says the fable, has the body of a lizard with a cock's head and wings, but instead of the comb, a kingly crown adorns it. But the peculiarity whereon rests its fame, and in which poets and prose writers without number have found a valuable comparison, was a beautiful eye, flashing like a jewel, with all colors of the rainbow. To look upon it was to experience exquisite delight, which lasted only for an instant, for one glance of that eye killed any animate thing that it rested on. Of all fabled birds, the most interesting was the phoenix. This is a beautiful legend, a yearning, it has been eloquently said, for a visible sign of immortality. Saint Cyril wrote, "God knows man's unbelief and provides the phoenix as an emblem of the resurrection." Clement said this bird goes to the land of Egypt once in 500 years, not to the desert, but to a notable city, to show forth the resurrection that as the Lord was killed and rose again, so the phoenix immolates itself in a fire of hemlock boughs, and from its ashes comes a worm which straightway grows into the bird of golden plumage with a purple body. The polished literature of the Latins from its birth until its immersion in the fogs of the Dark Ages glows with the description of the phoenix as a reality. Pliny knew the bird well. The populace believed in it. The grave Manlius rose in the Senate to mourn the departure of a phoenix which had resided near his house for 500 years. Among other flying creatures which existed in the popular belief of the Latins were the flying pig, an enormous hog with an appetite that ravaged the growing crops of Clazomenae, and the griffin, a lion with an eagle's head and wings. This last was adopted sometime in the misty past by various civilized governments as a symbol of guardianship, from the fact that its first appearance in fable was as a guard before the rich gold mines of Aramaspi. The griffin was provided with the powers attributed to the harpy, roc, dragon, and ogre, and it was man's deadly enemy and fear. Sir John Mandeville, and it was Sir John, by the way, who first caused doubts to descend upon travelers' tales, saw a griffin fly into a field and carry off a yoke of oxen. The Romans firmly believed in the satyr. Pliny said they lived in India, Albertus Magnus that they inhabited the woods of Saxony, another writer that the home was in the Atlas Mountains, and another that they were to be found in what is now Little Russia. There is no record that a satyr was ever seen alive. Even those voracious chroniclers, Sir John Mandeville and Marco Polo, never came across one. The Athenians were obliged to rest their dear belief on vague statements, and their sculptors to draw upon their wonderful imagination for the hairy man with a goat's legs. Albertus Magnus, however, wrote that he once saw a satyr pickled in brine at Alexandria, where the Ptolemies reigned, and collected such curiosities. The origin of the fabled unicorn, that horned supporter of the British crown and constitution, is easily accounted for by comparison with the antelope. But the origin of the once widespread belief in such a monster as the manticorus, with the body of a lion, the tail and sting of a serpent, and the face of a man, with 3 rows of teeth, is difficult to find. Man's imagination creates for one fairy or faun 100 monsters. Hence, the catalpes, the bird beast, whose look was death, the serpent with a head at each end of its body, the hydra-headed serpent, the gigantic tortoise of the East, and scores of others. Belief in some of these is not yet eradicated from among the ignorant peasantry of Eastern Europe. The very old belief that there is a variety of snake which milks the cow is especially firm and widespread, being not unknown in enlightened and educated America. Imagination has sounded the mysterious depths of the ocean and brought up the terrible Kraken or Kraken. There are thousands of Norwegian fishermen, it is said, to whom this monster is no fable. They can tell its presence by the water rising, when it rises to the surface in warm weather. Bishop Pontipputin's Kraken measured 1.5 miles across its back, and its arms were as long as the mast of a man-of-war. Though the fear it has inspired has exaggerated its size, there is good reason to believe that the Kraken, which is doubtless the great cuttlefish, grows to an enormous size. In 1873, a cuttlefish was washed ashore on the coast of Newfoundland, whose arms were estimated to measure 19 feet in length. In other parts of the world, specimens nearly as large have been seen. In the light of such facts, it is easy to read more seriously the stories of the cuttlefishes which have enfolded large craft in their arms and drawn them below. In the great cuttlefish and the sea serpent science, we are inclined to await developments before placing them in the list of fabulous animals. But modern naturalists, though according him respect for his learning, regard as curious fancies only Aldrovandi's pictures and descriptions of the seahorse, sea lion, sea devil, and sea sow. In the age of the Crusaders, dwellers on the coast of the Mediterranean believed in the zitairen, a fish with its head and breast clad in steel armor. The Arabians had the zedrosis, a fish so big that its bones were sawed into planks. The pretty fable of the mermaid and siren is slow in dying. Less than 50 years ago, the people of the country for miles around swarmed at a little seaport in the south of England at a rumor that a mermaid had been seen sitting on a rock combing its luxuriant locks in the moonlight. The sea satyr and the triton were familiar beliefs with the ancients. About 200 years ago, one of the latter was alleged to have been captured off the coast of Portugal in the very act of blowing his conch. Barnacle geese was a curious and strong belief in the Middle Ages. Sir John Mandeville did not omit to state that he had seen the diminutive goslings dropped from the shell of the mussel. Within a comparatively short period, a letter appeared in an English newspaper relating how a barnacle goose, grown to a great size, had swallowed a full-rigged ship, and all on board, save the writer. Chicago Inter-Ocean.